In March 1944, Hermann Göring, the man who commanded the most powerful air force in the world just 4 years earlier, looked out a window and saw American fighter planes over Berlin. He didn't call for reinforcements. He didn't order a counterattack. He said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Think about what it takes to break a man like Göring. This wasn't a general watching his army retreat. This was the Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, the air force that had conquered Poland in days, crushed France in weeks, and hunted Allied bombers across Europe for 2 straight years. And the sight of one American fighter plane over his capital was enough to tell him the war was over. Not the sight of 1,000 bombers, not an invasion fleet. One type of plane. Why? What was it about the P-51 Mustang that hit German pilots and German commanders at a level deeper than any aircraft they'd faced before? The answer isn't the speed, the guns, or even the kill ratio, though all 3 were exceptional. The dark reason German pilots hated the P-51 Mustang was something more fundamental than any technical specification. It was the moment they realized the rules of the air war, rules that had kept them alive, no longer existed. To understand what the P-51 took away from the Luftwaffe, you have to understand what the Luftwaffe had. By late 1943, the German fighter force had developed a system. The Americans were flying B-17 Flying Fortresses deep into Germany on daylight raids. Massive 4-engine bombers packed with machine guns. The theory was that tight formations of B-17s could defend themselves. They couldn't, not reliably. But the theory had one actual limit baked into it: range. American Escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, could only follow the bombers so far. Once they hit the edge of their fuel range, they had to turn back. And the moment those escorts peeled off, the Luftwaffe attacked. German pilots had developed specific tactics around this window. They knew exactly where the escorts turned around. They'd wait. Sometimes they'd trail the bomber formations at a distance, just out of range, killing time. Then, when the coast was clear, they'd come in. The system worked well enough that Luftwaffe commanders actually advised their pilots to simply avoid contact with the escorts. Don't waste energy fighting P-47s when the B-17s are unprotected just 100 miles further on. On October 14, 1943, this system produced the worst single day in American bomber history. 291 B-17 flew to Schweinfurt, Germany. The escort fighters turned back at the German border. The Luftwaffe was waiting. 60 bombers were shot down. Another 17 limped home so badly damaged they'd never fly again. More than 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Crews doing the math understood the odds. At the loss rates they were seeing, fewer than 1 in 3 would make it through a full tour. By the afternoon of October 14th, the men who landed at English airfields listened to the silence of runways that were supposed to be full and weren't. One bomb group lost 13 of its aircraft. Another lost all but 3. That day became known as Black Thursday, and it forced the 8th Air Force to stop sending bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe had found the answer. And then the P-51 showed up and took it away. The origin of the Mustang is one of the stranger stories in aviation history. In early 1940, the British desperately needed fighter aircraft and approached North American Aviation, an American company best known for making training planes, and asked them to build Curtiss P-40S under license. North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, made a different proposal. His company would design a completely new fighter, from scratch, in the time it would take just to set up a production line for the P-40. The British said yes. North American delivered a prototype airframe 102 days later. It first flew in October 1940. That prototype had a problem. It was powered by an Allison engine that degraded severely above 15,000 feet, exactly the altitude where bombers flew. The early Mustang was a fine low-level fighter and reconnaissance aircraft, but it wasn't the weapon that would change the war. Not yet. The transformation came from a British experiment. In 1942, RAF engineers fitted Mustang airframes with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines powering Spitfires. The results were immediately and obviously extraordinary. The Merlin-powered Mustang hit over 400 miles per hour at altitude. At the altitudes where bombers flew, it could outperform the FW-190 and match or beat the BF-109 in most combat conditions. It could turn, climb, and dive with anything the Luftwaffe had. By summer 1943, Packard Motor Company in Detroit was building Merlins under license, and the new P-51B was rolling off assembly lines in Inglewood, California. There was still the range problem. No single-engine fighter had ever escorted heavy bombers to Berlin and back. The engineering assumption in both Germany and America was that it simply couldn't be done, that the fuel load required would be too heavy, the aircraft too compromised. But the P-51's laminar-flow wing, a radical aerodynamic design that drastically reduced drag, gave it fuel efficiency no other fighter could match. With external drop tanks jettisoned before combat and an additional internal fuselage tank added mid-production, the Mustang could fly over 1,600 miles. The 1,100-mile round trip to Berlin and back was suddenly possible. In December 1943, the first P-51Bs arrived in England. A new unit, the 354th Fighter Group, flew their first escort missions over Germany that month. The Luftwaffe's window had just closed. What happened next wasn't just a shift in tactics. It was a psychological dismantling that German pilots described in almost identical terms when captured and interrogated. For years, the Luftwaffe's intercept doctrine had a logical structure. Wait for the escorts to turn back, attack the bombers in the unprotected gap. When P-51s arrived in strength in early 1944, that structure vanished. There was no gap. The American fighters were there at the target. They were there on the way back. Some days, they were still over the German airfields when the defending fighters tried to land. The numbers told the story immediately. Early engagements went one way. Mustang groups coming home having shot down multiples of what they'd lost, sometimes returning without a single plane down. These weren't just victories. They were statements about what the air war had become. Then General Jimmy Doolittle changed the rules further. Until early 1944, American fighter pilots had strict orders: stay with the bombers, drive off attackers, return to close escort. Doolittle pulled down the sign on his subordinate commander's wall that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." He replaced it with a new one. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." The P-51s were no longer a shield. They were a hunting force. Entire groups of Mustangs began ranging 50 miles ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping the routes clear. After escort duty, instead of flying home, pilots dropped to low altitude and strafed Luftwaffe airfields. German fighters that survived a dogfight would return to base and find their runway under attack. Pilots that made it down safely sometimes didn't survive landing. The war had moved to their side of the border, and it had followed them home. This was not incidental. It was deliberate policy. Doolittle understood that the Luftwaffe's real vulnerability wasn't its aircraft. Germany was still building fighters at high rates even in 1944. It was pilots. You could replace a Messerschmitt. You couldn't replace the man who'd spent 3 years learning how to fly one into combat and walk away. Every experienced pilot killed on a strafing run, every ace who didn't make it off a burning runway, was a loss the German training system had no way to cover. The Luftwaffe's response to this tells you everything about the pressure they were under. German commanders ordered their pilots to avoid fighting P-51s when possible. Focus on the bombers, disengage from the escorts. This was a rational instruction given the tactical situation, but think about what it meant in practice. You are a Luftwaffe interceptor pilot. Your job is to stop the bombers. To reach the bombers, you have to fly through a screen of American fighters that are faster than you above 20,000 feet, as maneuverable as anything you've flown, and carrying 4 50 caliber machine guns. Your commanders are telling you not to engage. But the bombers are right there, and the Mustangs are not going to let you get to them. That was the trap. And it was a trap the Germans had no answer to. Declassified American interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots, compiled as late as March 1945, show a striking consistency. Experienced veterans, pilots who had survived hundreds of missions, rated the P-51 as the best fighter they had faced. Not just technically superior, demoralizing in a specific structural way. Against the Spitfire, you knew your limits and theirs. Against the P-47, you could outperform it under certain conditions. Against the Mustang above 20,000 feet, the interrogation reports say, you tried to run if you had a significant head start. If you didn't, you fought and hoped. By March 1944, when Göring made his Berlin observation, the losses had already passed the point of recovery. German pilot training programs couldn't produce replacements fast enough. Experienced pilots were dying. New ones arrived with a fraction of the hours their predecessors had logged. The edge Germany had spent years building was gone. One Luftwaffe fighter commander, Kurt Bühligen, put it plainly after the war. Pilots being transferred in from the Eastern Front, veterans who had flown hundreds of missions against Soviet aircraft, were arriving with almost no grasp of what the Western Air War had become. None of them, he said, seemed to last long. They had the hours, they had the instincts, but the skies over Germany in 1944 were something the Eastern Front hadn't prepared anyone for. During Big Week in February 1944, a concentrated week of bombing and escort operations, Mustang pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilot pool in air-to-air combat in 7 days. And despite making up a minority of the overall escort force that week, the P-51 shot down more Luftwaffe aircraft per sortie than any other American fighter. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew fewer than 250 sorties against the largest amphibious operation in history, outnumbered nearly 40-1 in the air. One famous pass by a pair of FW-190s became the defining image of German air power that day, not because it was dramatic, but because there was almost nothing else to show. The aircraft that made that possible wasn't the B-17. It wasn't the tanks assembling in southern England. It was the plane that had spent the previous 4 months hunting the Luftwaffe into impotence over its own territory. After the war, Göring gave a more complete answer than his famous Berlin quote. He said the reason the Luftwaffe failed was specific. The Americans had produced a long-range escort fighter that could accompany the bombers deep into Germany and still outfight German interceptors. Without that escort, the air offensive would never have succeeded. In the European theater, P-51 pilots claimed roughly 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed during the war, more than any other Allied fighter in that theater. Less than 2 years of serious combat operations. A kill-to-loss ratio that captured Luftwaffe veterans described, under interrogation, as something close to impossible to fight on equal terms. And the airframe that made all of it possible was designed in 102 days in 1940 by a company that had never built a fighter before. The dark reason German pilots hated the P-51 Mustang was that it didn't just outperform their aircraft. It removed the conditions that had made the Luftwaffe's defensive system functional. The window between escort range and the target? Gone. The ability to reach the bombers without fighting through a hunter screen? Gone. The certainty that surviving a mission meant landing safely at home? Gone. The assumption that American fighters would stay on their side of the border? Gone. When Göring looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin, he wasn't reacting to a tactical defeat. He was recognizing what the sight of that aircraft over his capital actually meant. The Americans had built a machine that could follow you anywhere, and it was better than what you had to stop it. If that's the kind of story you come here for, there are more of them. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us for every weapon, every unit, and every dark reason the war went the way it did.